The once mighty frame of Napoleon Bonaparte had become scarcely recognizable. His body had swollen to grotesque proportions, the skin stretched taut and discolored, as if his very flesh were rebelling against him. Ulcers burst open and seeped foul matter, their stench so overpowering that even the wide windows could not drive it away. The odor clung to everything, to the garments of his attendants, to the hair of those who dared enter, even to the very stones of the walls. His bed was soaked with a blackish ooze, and the pillows beneath his head had turned a deep, blood-red stain. The chamber that once housed the master of Europe now reeked like a crypt. Thus ended the life of the man who had once struck fear into every court across the continent. Napoleon Bonaparte, the commander before whom kings had bowed, who dictated laws to nations, who had dared to style himself the savior of an age. He was exalted as the god of war, a living legend whose victories had redrawn the map of Europe. Yet his final days were consumed by horror. Each hour dragged on as torment, each breath a reminder of his decay. His body rotted while he still lived. His mind drifted, swinging between volcanic rage and paranoid suspicion. The world remembered the indomitable general, but what remained was only a shadow, a pitiful ghost of his former strength. How had the Titan fallen so low? How could the man who crowned himself emperor, convinced that destiny had marked him for eternal rule, now lie imprisoned on a barren rock in the middle of the ocean? The conqueror of Austerlitz, Marengo, and Jena ended his days bloated, diseased, and half-mad, surrounded not by cheering armies but by British guards and the flickering shadows of memory. Why did Europe's greatest commander not die on the battlefield, at the head of his legions, but instead in a chamber reeking of sickness? Why did the god of war meet his end in helpless agony, his belly swollen like a grotesque drum, cut open by the knives of foreign doctors? This is not the version preserved in schoolbooks, nor the image carved into marble or painted in triumphal portraits. It is the darker truth, whispered in hushed tones, the collapse of body and spirit, the decay of a man who once believed himself untouchable. Only by tracing his rise and his ruin can one understand how the myth of an immortal hero was stripped bare, revealing the fragile mortal beneath. Napoleon Bonaparte was born on August 15, 1769, on the island of Corsica, newly taken from the Genoese by the French. His origins were far removed from the grandeur he would later claim. His family bore a noble name, but their means were modest, lacking wealth or the refinements of Parisian society. Yet even in boyhood, Napoleon stood apart, quick in mind, coldly determined, unwilling to bend. At the French military academy, his classmates remembered him as sullen and withdrawn, often silent, brooding at the edges of the room. But when a map or a book of strategy fell into his hands, his entire expression transformed. His eyes burned with an intensity that unsettled those nearby. It was as though he could already see the battle unfolding before him, calculating moves far ahead before a single step had been taken. By the age of 30, he was already First Consul of France. A British diplomat wrote of him, "He enters a hall as though it already belongs to him, and speaks as though permission were beneath him." Napoleon did not wait for consent. He reached out and took what he wanted. In Italy, he had inherited not an army but a starving mob. Soldiers barefoot and in rags, without pay, more rabble than regiment. Yet under his command, they became a force that shook Europe. They marched out as beggars and returned as victors, laden with plundered gold, stolen art, conquered provinces, and above all, glory. It was in those campaigns that the legend of the young general was born, victories so swift and dazzling they seemed touched by destiny itself. Even the Egyptian expedition, a failure by any measure, only added to the myth. His soldiers perished by disease, the fleet was destroyed by the British, yet Napoleon returned not as a defeated commander but as a hero. For he understood a truth that would shape his reign. Image mattered more than reality. His men might die in deserts, but in Paris, he was hailed as the one who had opened the East. When the capital fell once more into chaos, he seized the moment. Without bloodshed, without a single shot, Napoleon Bonaparte took power. At first, Napoleon spoke cautiously of liberty, drafted laws in the name of the people, and cloaked himself in the language of justice. Yet the mask was thin, and it soon slipped away. Year by year, the ceremonies grew more extravagant. The titles multiplied without end. At last, beneath the great dome of Notre Dame, he stood with the crown in his hands. And when, instead of bowing before the Pope, he placed it upon his own head, no one dared to resist. In that single gesture, the general became an emperor. From that moment, power was no longer a tool but his very identity. He wrapped himself in robes heavier than a soldier's armor, signed decrees with words once reserved for kings, reshaped calendars, and redrew borders. Brothers and relatives were set upon thrones like chess pieces moved at his will. All the while, he ensured the world saw him as he wished to be seen. Painters portrayed him as a new Caesar, poets praised him as divine, and courtiers whispered of his immortality. Weakness, compromise, or shame were unthinkable. He demanded that Europe believe in his invincibility, and in time he came to believe it himself. To understand his decline, one must remember the France from which he rose. The memory of the Jacobin terror was still raw. From 1793 to 1794 the guillotine worked without rest. The streets ran with blood, and virtue collapsed into chaos. Society unraveled, and with it the army. Disease spread swiftly through the camps, turning into epidemic. Contemporary doctors believed that more than half the soldiers were infected. Historians suggest Napoleon himself may have carried the same affliction. By 1797, only a year after his marriage to Josephine, the first signs appeared. Headaches, dizziness, and painful urination revealed a hidden infection that would erode his body over time. The marriage itself bore the same shadow. Josephine had already lost the ability to bear children, a common consequence of illness in that age. From the beginning, sickness and infertility haunted their union. As years passed, his ailments deepened. In 1802, at only 33, he was struck down by violent stomach pains. He collapsed to the floor, vomiting in agony. The more his body betrayed him, the more erratic his behavior grew. Those near him spoke of sudden, mechanical encounters that ended in anger. His aides recalled volcanic moods, shouting fits, overturned furniture, fists slammed against walls, followed by long, sullen silences. In councils he faltered. He contradicted himself, lost his train of thought, and struggled to focus. In 1806 his vision blurred so severely he nearly went blind for a week. By 1811 even his speech failed him at times. He gave orders and forgot them within the hour. He accused allies of treason, then forgot the accusations. Doctors observed tremors in his left leg, twitching at the corner of his mouth, and a limp in his step. At night he moaned from stabbing pain in his limbs. These were unmistakable signs of a failing nervous system, the late stages of a disease eating him from within. Yet no one dared name it aloud. To speak of his weakness was forbidden. Courtiers muttered of fatigue and stress, but in whispers the truth was plain. The emperor was no longer the same. In 1813, at Dresden, triumph should have been his once more. The Allies faltered, and the moment was there to be seized. But instead of a decisive blow, silence spread through the camp. Napoleon lay inside his tent, writhing with pain, his lungs straining, his belly convulsing, diarrhea leaving him too weak to mount his horse. Wrapped in blankets, he whispered, "My mind resists, but the body surrenders." For the first time, his weakness broke through the mask of command. From that moment, sickness became a part of politics. Generals acted on their own. His condition was hidden, but those closest to him knew the truth. The moans, the way he clutched his stomach, the way he needed help just to rise. Even the defeat at Waterloo, crushing as it was, did not match the humiliation that followed. At only 46, Napoleon was sent into exile, his body already swollen, his features aged before their time. His new prison was Saint Helena, a volcanic rock in the Atlantic, far from Europe, far from politics, far from the armies that once carried his banners. The British had chosen well. Escape was impossible, the climate harsh, the conditions bleak. Here, the conqueror of Europe was reduced to a captive. From the moment of his arrival, his health unraveled further. He ate little and vomited often. His stomach swelled grotesquely, as though stone pressed against his ribs. Officers who attended him wrote of the stench that filled his rooms, the sour reek of rot and vomit that no ocean wind could clear. Flowers placed by servants withered within hours. As his body weakened, his mind turned more suspicious. He became convinced that poison lurked in his food. He ordered tastings before every meal, dismissed cooks, distrusted even the most loyal attendants. His paranoia grew alongside his pain. The worse his body failed, the more fiercely he clung to legend. He dictated memoirs, rewrote letters, struck out failures, reshaping his story into the one he wanted the world to remember. On paper, he built a monument, even as his flesh collapsed in reality. By 1821, he rarely left his bed. His face was swollen, his eyes inflamed, his skin gray-green. His stomach ballooned like a drum, while his legs wasted into sticks, the muscles gone until he could hardly place them on the floor. Eating became torture. Water made him retch. Wine burned like metal. Meat twisted his belly in agony. Servants wrote of him clutching his stomach, staggering from the table, nearly collapsing from pain. The stench grew unbearable. Even in winter, the windows were left open to draw in the sea air. Lamps burned through the night, for he feared the dark. He demanded constant light, inspected his bed before lying down, and drank only from his own cup. He accused those around him of betrayal, then fell into long silences, staring at nothing. He raged, then wept, then whispered. The emperor who had once terrified kings now feared a shadow in the corner and a crust of bread upon his plate. The physicians who attended him could do nothing to halt his suffering. They bled him, punctured his swollen belly, and filled his body with mercury. Each attempt only drove him closer to death. His tongue grew heavy, his breathing became harsh and uneven, and his mouth overflowed with dark, clotted blood. By spring, he no longer had the strength to sit upright. Witnesses recalled how he murmured the names of old victories, Austerlitz, Marengo, Jena, as if trying to summon back the man he had once been. The house itself was transformed into a place of dying. The air inside hung thick with the smell of sweat, sickness, and rot. Hardened veterans who had marched through battlefields struggled to remain in the chamber. By May of 1821, it was beyond doubt. The emperor's end was approaching. On May 4th, he finally allowed a priest to hear his confession. For decades, he had lived behind the armor of invincibility, but now he admitted what could no longer be denied. His voice was almost gone, and when asked of his faith, he managed only the faintest of nods. The next evening, May 5th, as the hour neared 6, his breath grew shallow and broken. His face drained of life, his lips trembled open. With great effort, he whispered 3 final words. France, the army, Josephine. Then silence. Napoleon was dead. What remained was a body swollen and stiff, horrifying to behold. When the autopsy began, the stench was so overpowering that the windows had to be thrown wide and the doctors pressed cloths to their faces. They found his stomach eaten away by ulcers, blackened and rotting. The organ was removed and sealed in alcohol. The official verdict was stomach cancer. Yet whispers persisted that he had been slowly poisoned, that arsenic explained the swelling, the torment, the fits of rage. Whatever the truth, even in death his corpse unnerved those who had once followed him. His skin turned a waxen yellow, his lips shriveled, his hands curled into claws. The uniform laid upon him hung loose, and the sword beside him looked as if it belonged to someone else entirely. For days later, on May 9th, he was laid to rest. The British provided only a plain wooden box, lined by the French with tin. His grave was dug in a hollow of the island, in the Valley of the Geraniums. By order of the governor, no name was carved into the stone. No epitaph, no title, no emperor, only a mound of earth, as though he were a nameless soldier abandoned after battle. Irony lingered over his burial. The man who once crowned himself and held the fate of Europe in his hands was lowered into the ground without a name. His only legitimate son, the King of Rome, lived far away in a foreign court, stripped of rank, denied his homeland. He too died young, leaving behind little more than the memory of a broken destiny. The empire carved out through rivers of blood collapsed within months of his fall. Its power returned to old enemies. What he believed eternal proved brief and fragile. And yet not all was erased. The Napoleonic Code endured, shaping the laws of nations. His reforms in schools outlasted kings. And his campaigns, studied even now, remain masterpieces of military art. Yet alongside the legacy that endured lies a darker memory. An emperor undone not by gunfire or bayonets, but by the slow collapse of his own body. Choked by the stench of rot, consumed by suspicion and pain, the so-called god of war ended as a captive within his own flesh. He could shift borders, crown kings, and redraw Europe at will, but he could not command the disease that hollowed him from within. Nations bent before him, yet the ulcers in his stomach would not yield. His fate stood as a brutal reminder. Glory may dazzle the world, but it cannot purchase immortality. Napoleon longed to be remembered as the eternal victor. Instead, he left behind another story as well, the chronicle of his downfall. His life began with the blare of trumpets, and closed with the whisper of ivy and the dull strike of shovels into damp soil. So ended the journey of the man who once set Europe trembling. His body wasted in an unmarked grave, while his name survived both as triumph and as warning. The greatest conqueror of his century faced his last campaign, against time, against death itself, and fell without a single shot fired.